Welcome back to the Training Model Podcast. Back for a little recap of some ideas that I've been having discussions with this week with clients, mentorship students, Instagram DMs, content, whatever it might be. There's also some really exciting things happening behind the scenes and open, not just behind the scenes, but I am coming up to Sydney at the end of March. I can actually start talking about it now, which is fantastic. But One Playground, which is a fantastic sort of bigger chain gym up in New South Wales that are dominating and expanding. They reached out towards the end of last year after I went up there for a small workshop that I did with some of their coaches. When I say some, there was like 30 people there. You might have seen it on Instagram. But after that workshop and some of the feedback, they reached out and wanted to put forth this idea of building out sort of like education partnerships within Australia and people that could come and help upskill their growing number of coaches and staff members there at the gym, or multiple gyms there. And that has been happening behind the scenes. And the first intake for a private sort of online course and some workshops will be kicking off in March, which is unbelievable. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's a 6-week sort of all packaged course. So 2 workshops up there and 4 weeks of online lectures, which I'm so incredibly thankful to be part of. And I think I'm going to have a big impact with the coaches there. And it just opens up a lot of doors for doing more work in New South Wales, which has been something I want to do. I do want to travel more around Australia and get in front of people more. So I've just been blessed with a fantastic opportunity there. That's means I'm actually coming up at the end of March. So I've got their first workshop on Friday, the 27th of March, but I'm staying up for another day and I'm running a public workshop, on Saturday, the 28th of March. So if you are in New South Wales or you don't mind traveling and you want to come to the start of, it's kind of like the first real crack at building a 2-day workshop. This one is only going to be 1 day, just heavily on the movement side of things. But I want to build a 2-day full-blown workshop, deep dive into the model, practical application for both movement and programming. That's my longer term goal for this year, and to do that in every state at some point. Maybe not this year in every state, but definitely get to some new states that I haven't been to. Perth is probably the top of my list outside of New South Wales. But I really want to push workshops. I just want to do more, give people more opportunity to feel and experience some of these ideas in person ultimately. So that's why I love that opportunity with One Playground, because it gets me more face-to-face time with coaches. But I also want to run my own workshop. So I am coming to Sydney on the 28th of March. So if you're interested in coming to that, I think we settled on 6 hours with City Strength. It's at City Strength HQ. Thank you to Greta and John for always supporting me and my sort of my work, I guess, my ideas. It will be at City Strength HQ on Saturday, the 28th of March. It will be probably second link down below, because the first link down below is the Movement Mentorship, which the intake is currently open. It closes on the 20th of Feb, so next Friday. Once that closes, I'll open up the mid-year intake for the expansion of it, which will be fucking mad. But very keen for intake 5 of the Movement Mentorship as well, which is down below. That's just 2 little recaps on my end. But a conversation that has been popping up a lot, I don't know what's going on, especially in the applied mentorship. We've been chatting a lot about lateralisation of center of mass. So obviously, and I made a post, I'm probably going to make a few more posts this week on it, just because it seems to be an interesting topic that people are at least taking value from the first post that I made about it, which was just the skeleton post. But lateralisation of center of mass. So obviously I speak a lot about sagittal plane center of mass, so forward and back transition of weight. And I talk heavily about sort of like midfoot loading and learning to balance and structure your skeleton or support your skeleton over your midfoot and learning to load in that position, learning about these brace positions, these retracted rib cage positions, these forward and overhead reach positions. Like I hammer that idea of center of mass. And ultimately, the reason is because it sagittal plane center of mass has such a big impact on basically everything and everyone. It's always like the first place I start and recommend coaches start with when trying to improve any movement limitation, any sort of movement breakdown, whatever you want to call it, whatever you call it. Your definition is fine and can roll with it. Doesn't have to be my terminology, but the sagittal plane center of mass is, I would say, probably like 80% of the coaching strategy that I would recommend people. And there's a lot within just sagittal plane center of mass, but there's also like this frontal and transverse. I group the two together, frontal and transverse plane mass management. And ultimately, you can view this through a number of lenses. The dynamic transition of lateralisation of mass would be used through like a gait cycle as the sort of lens to understand it, which would be like your stance leg transitioning towards your stance leg and then off your stance leg. Like a Bill Hartman model would use like the propulsive sort of terminology, early, middle, and late stance propulsion. There's many ways in which you could sort of like try to term that transitional sort of loading and unloading on one leg. But in the gym, where things are a little bit more static and where things are a little bit more controlled, I think a fantastic frame or a fantastic lens to learn it from is something that I learned from Pat Davidson, which is just the lateralization in like a static posture. He uses the statue of David as kind of like the golden archetype of the position. But ultimately what we're talking about in the gym with lateralization of center of mass is just transitioning your weight to one leg. So this would ultimately hold a lot of sort of impact to single leg loaded exercises like split squats, lunges, kickstands, hinges, single leg loaded, whatever it might be, any of those standing posture stuff. But it also comes into trunk position. So closing one side of your rib cage and opening the other. So compressing one side and opening the other, which can be very helpful with improving mobility at the shoulders and the hips. But it also has huge implications to pelvis in the frontal plane. So frontal plane pelvis. So when we think about bringing your weight to one leg, what we're actually going to start to see on that stance side is actually a hiking of the pelvis. So in the frontal plane, a pelvis hike would just mean that one side lifts as the other side drops down. And that hiking side brings together with it like a pretty aggressive adduction moment of the hip. So adduction and internal rotation is more than likely what's going to ride together at that hip, which is more often than not something that is limited with people. And especially if you've got people that like shift to one side or they can't sort of load on one side, like a squat, they shift to one side, a deadlift, they shift to one side. You go to a split squat, one side's really balanced, the other side's like a little bit unstable, quote unquote. What you would find is that their ability to actually load their mass on that side is probably limited. And when we view it from a bone first, skeleton first sort of vantage, what we're actually trying to achieve is this skeletal position that should happen when we're on a static stanced leg. And part of that is the hip hike, that pelvis hike on that loaded side, which brings that adduction and internal rotation into the hip. And I've been chatting about this heaps, mostly in the applied mentorship in terms of like detailed conversations, plus a couple of one-on-one mentorship calls with just people that have clients that and a few people just themselves that have limitations in that frontal plane. They have like hip internal rotation deficits on one side, or they have like a inability to load the lateral hip. They have an inability to feel their adductors loading, potentially like even like straining adductors, like if it's more of an athletic population. Osteitis pubis was a conversation that we ended up having. And ultimately, like the presentation, I don't think matters too much for us as coaches. What actually matters is, do our clients have access to these ranges? Can they hold these skeletal shapes? Because if they don't have access to the ranges, or if they don't have the potential to hold the skeletal shape, we know that there is this muscular strategy underneath it that is no longer supporting these movements, which means there's probably some benefit in going to explore that frontal plane pelvic position, that hiking and dropping, potentially some lateral hip strengthening work or lateral hip sensory work, some proximal like medial hip sensory work. So like your foam roller, internal and external rotations, hip rolling, some people call them, scissor lifts, I think, or scissor rolls is another name for it. But all of those little drills can be really helpful in trying to, like, I view it as kind of like grease and groove that IR, ER strategy, that hiking and dropping of the pelvis strategy that might be limited. And I think it's something that I'm going to explore a little bit more. I might produce some specific content, as I said, for Instagram to discuss this frontal plane transition, because I think it is really, really beneficial, especially for people that have some more unique cases for helping clients with their movement strategies. And I just wanted to go through today like a little bit of, not so much a sequence, but a little bit of an idea of how you might start to explore these positions. And the framework that I'm going to use for this is my sensory motor continuum. So we'll unpack that to start with, but it's arguably, I think, my main, outside of center of mass, I think it's my main coaching framework. In fact, it is definitely my main coaching framework, to help coaches better understand how they can actually help their clients. So at one end of the sensory motor continuum, so I view it at left to right, at the left-hand side, the sensory end, what we're looking for there is productive learning environment. So when we think of like the central nervous system's ability to coordinate movement and develop motor control, develop skill expression of particular movements, part of that is the system actually needs to learn and feel and experience, and an emphasis on feel, the positions that we're looking to find and achieve. So at the sensory end of your coaching strategy, it's going to be very low level things. It's going to be very quote unquote safe is another term that you could view it, but high proprioception. Quite often you're on the ground or against a wall, you're feeling things. It's slow movement. It's isolated joint movements and positions. A lot of it is breathing focus. That's where the breathing drills live for me, is down that sensory end. You can make breathing drills more challenging, but most of the time they just live at the sensory end of the continuum. And the sensory end is for productive learning. So we want the client to actually feel the position that we're trying to get them to engage with. You then flip to the other end of the continuum, which is the motor end, which is your output-driven training, which is what everybody understands to be productive training. So sensory end is productive learning. At the motor end, it's productive training. So this would be dynamic movements, loaded movements, progressed movements, training higher RPEs. Like everybody knows what that motor end, that motor output end of the continuum is. And the strategy that I recommend to coaches to learn when you're viewing your decision making in this framework is, how far down do I need to slide towards the sensory end in order for the client to perceive and understand what I'm asking them to do? And it's not us just putting words in their mouth. It's getting them to actually feel and experience the position that I'm asking them for. A lot of the time, and like a common case of this would be like squat U, and some of the comment sections within Squat University's sort of strategy. A lot of the time, coaches feel that they have to break everything down and just run to the sensory end and do all these unloaded, hyper-specific positions and drills to try to get these feelings and get the clients to experience what we're looking for from a movement strategy. I don't agree with that. Yes, there is benefit to going all the way down the sensory end, but more often than not, you just have to slide people away from the motor end a little bit for them to feel and experience what they're looking for. A simple case of this would be somebody that is extending their squat pattern. You just go to an anterior load. And that anterior load, still push the squat, still challenge it as hard as you can, but the anterior load forces their ribcage to position, forces their obliques and their abs into position, forces their pelvis into a position that they can sense and feel. Different story if you use an anterior load, it still looks like shit, it still feels like shit. You might have to go a little bit further down and go to like a plank with a reach, go to some sort of anterior core specific thing, some bracing strategy, maybe even a 90-90 hip lift. But you really only have to slide down the continuum as much as they need to feel and experience and express what we're looking for. So that's the sensory motor continuum. And more often than not, one or two really well executed sensory drills is enough for the client to feel it, that they can then start to express that in the more motor end of their training experience and in their training process. So when we apply this framework to frontal plane pelvis, what we're actually looking for the client to experience is we're looking for them to be able to hike and drop their pelvis in the frontal plane. And then we're looking for them to be able to turn their pelvis towards the loaded leg and turn it away from the loaded leg. So you may have seen on my YouTube channel, there are these drills called exploration drills. I'm pretty sure they're public, but you could also look up pelvis driver if you wanted to have a look at those sort of things. But ultimately what we're doing with the B stance pelvis driver and the split squats pelvis driver is starting to get the client to feel that pelvis-driven motion, learning to move and orient their pelvis on top of a fixed femur. That's the frontal plane pelvis sort of drill idea, the sensory experience that we're trying to get the client to feel. And once the client starts to feel and understand that pelvis driver, they can start to hike into that hip and close that adduction space. They can start to drop away from that hip as they push into the floor and use their hip and their glute, their lateral hip and their glute muscles to sort of push out of that position. In the frontal plane, that is, and then in the transverse plane, learning to load and turn the pelvis into the loaded leg, and then again learning to turn the pelvis out and away. Like a hip aeroplane can be a fantastic sort of sensory drill to experience this feeling of a pelvis driver in both the frontal and transverse plane, because you can change your torso angle. Bonus points if you pin the shin against something, so you fix the femur, fix the leg, fix the foot pressure, and then learn to orient your mass and your skeleton on top of that leg. All of those drills are very productive learning positions for clients to feel and experience what we're trying to get with this pelvis-driven frontal plane mass. Once you've got that feeling and you can get them to experience that, that is where you can then start to push up towards the motor end. You start adding load, you start making it dynamic, you start adding sort of intensity and expressions of fatigue and all of that sort of stuff into the positions. And quite often you'll find that if somebody is struggling with some frontal plane hip stuff, adductors, glute medis, TFLs, QLs, low backs, like all of that sort of stuff in this transition from left to right stance or shifting in the squats or any of those sort of things, if you can just spend a little bit of time exploring that frontal plane pelvis, exploring that hike, exploring that turn towards the loaded side, and exploring that on a grounded foot, medial foot pressure, keeping the foot engaged to the ground, it will probably only take one or two little sets for them to get the feeling that they're looking for and then pushing that back towards the motor end as quickly as possible. The other one would be that hip IR and ER, which is a little bit more femoral driven, so leg driven, distal driven motion into the pelvis. But that can also be a fantastic strategy to try to unlock some of this range in the in this frontal plane sort of lateralisation of center of mass idea. One other thing, because this was happening with a client this week. I've onboarded a new client who does a lot of riding, like hours and hours of riding per week, and he's been struggling with some pelvic floor stuff for the last couple of years. He's seeing a specialist. The specialist recommended he go and sort of progress the things with the strength coach, or strength and conditioning coach, and that's where I come in. But I've been helping this client with some pelvic floor dramas, and something that had been recommended to him was like 90-90 switches. I don't know if you know that hip drill where you drop one leg into IR and the other leg falls to ER, and then you kind of actively switch back and forth. It's a very common mobility drill for people to try to improve rotation at the hips, which is fantastic. It's fine. It's a sensory drill. It can work. It's definitely something worth exploring. But with this client particularly, we have identified within just the first week of coaching that his ability to just use his pelvis to turn and load around his hips is borderline not there at all. Like these exploration drills that I've asked him to do and film for me, it's just not he just has no control of this pelvis in space. Everything looks really blocky. It's not fluid. Things are provocative. Like there's just no free motion around this pelvis-driven idea, this frontal plane, this transverse plane hip strategy. And I actually told him to stop doing those hip switches because of that. And this is part of this reason where center of mass as the base principle of human movement sort of comes in and rears its head, is because you can try to do all of the mobility drills that you want, like direct hip mobility drills. You can do all the stretching, you can do all the switches, you can do all of the whatever else, FRC strategies, like all of that, like hip control, hip mobility based drills. But if you don't have control of your mass, if you don't have control of your pelvis when you're trying to load and unload a single leg position, if you don't have the ability to position your mass where you need it to be in order to produce force down into the ground, none of that mobility stuff is ever going to stick. You are just going to continue to run into the same roadblocks, because what is limiting your range of motion at a joint is not a particular structure, muscle, tightness, weakness, stability, whatever it needs to be, or whatever narrative people wrap around it. At the layer deeper than the presentation that we're seeing and trying to fix, like the symptom that we're seeing is the root cause of why the skeleton can't access that position to start with, or control that position to start with. And that is because the center of mass strategy, the gravity management strategy underneath that the central nervous system is firstly and most importantly trying to manage is not there. We've got mass positioned in the wrong sort of area of our base of support. We've got the wrong foot pressure to express the mobility that we're looking to actually achieve. And just going to try to fight these symptoms of my hips feel tight, my back feels tight, and all of that sort of stuff, that all becomes secondary to actually learning to manage your mass. And that mass management is this sagittal plane, first and foremost, and then this lateralisation, getting on one leg productively, loading into the ground on that leg, using force on that leg, and then getting off that leg and loading the other leg and learning to control and coordinate that position. If you don't fix your center of mass management strategy, you will just continue to fall into the traps of these mobility things, always feeling tight, always feeling stiff, always feeling the same symptoms, because that's what all of that stuff is. Those things are symptoms. They are like the alarm bells of a system that is not dealing with gravity first and foremost, or not dealing with it in a productive way for your training outcomes and your goals. And that's why I always just harp back to center of mass. And this lateralisation conversation is coming up more. So I'm definitely going to be producing more content on that. But again, technical chat, I know it is. Hopefully, again, I'm always looking for feedback on it. Hopefully, there's a couple of things that you could start to think about, at least, especially that sensory motor continuum. That's a key principle of mine. It's definitely a key coaching framework. The reason I like sensory motor is because it lives within the central nervous system, like the sensory inputs of the nervous system and the motor outputs of the movement expression. The sensory motor continuum lives within that terminology, lives within that understanding, lives within that truth. And that's why I like that terminology for discussing those ideas. So maybe there's some stuff in there that you could unpack. I've got other content on the YouTube channel as well for those sort of ideas. But also, if you want to chat in the DMs with these sort of topics, just hit me a DM. Or if you really enjoy them, Movement Mentorship Intake 5 kicks off Friday next week. That's the first link down below. The second link down below is the Sydney Workshop, which will be the start of building a killer 2-day workshop. So hopefully we can see you there as well. The tickets are $440 for the day on that. I'm not expecting a huge turnout. I've kind of given myself grace for the first 6 months of this new direction with everything. Like I'm trying not to have, it's very difficult for me not to have objective goals in terms of like signups and sales and workshop attendees and all of that sort of stuff. Like, I don't have huge expectations, but I'd love to get to 10 people. I think if we can get to 10, we're at 2 currently, but if we can get to 10, I'd be very, very happy with that. And I think it would be a really fantastic group to go through. So if you are in New South Wales and keen to come along, or surrounding areas and not too opposed to traveling, would love to see you there. March 28th, Saturday, March the 28th, up in New South Wales. And depending on the amount of people that I can get and the cost of a videographer, I might video that and use some of that for future content as well, because I think there'll be some good things that happen from that. I'm very keen to do that because I want to build a proper 2-day course that eventually, or workshop, that eventually I can travel with, not just around Australia, but I want to get international. It's a huge goal of mine and something I really want to work towards. So they are the two things coming up, and I think that is all I'm going to chat about in today's episode. That we will wrap it up there. So always keen for feedback. Drop a comment, send me a DM. Happy to chat. We'll wrap it up there, and I'll see you next week.